How's it going, everyone? I am Alex from Level Up Plus VFX, and welcome to the second episode or second part of our Silo Environment series. In this episode, we'll be focusing on the lighting and texturing of our scene. By the end of this video, I hope to have shared with you not just how to light and texture an interior scene, but also how to be economical with your textures and lights. Dark interior scenes almost always will take a long time to render, so learning how to avoid some of the pitfalls that can cause those render times to balloon in size even further is an essential skill for new Blender artists. By the end of today, you should have a scene that looks like what you're seeing on screen right now, which neatly puts us at the 90% mark for this entire project. But that's enough of a preamble for now. Let's jump straight into this project and get started. Now, I know this looks slightly different than the project we left off on, and that's because I made a couple improvements to our silo that I want to go over right now before we jump into the lighting and texturing. And the first is for our silo geometry object, which we created in the last video. One of the things I did to improve the speed and performance of this entire scene was I added a new little bit to our geometry node system that we're going to see come up a couple times in this video. After our instance on points node, I added a delete geometry node, and I set that to instances. This is so I can delete pieces of the silo that aren't actually visible in the camera, saving us a lot of memory. After all, we are instancing just a whole load of stuff, so removing it when we can is pretty optimal. I did this by creating a position node and using a separate XYZ node to isolate just the Z axis. That's going to be the up and down. I then added a less than node and set it to less than, with A as my Z input, and then I controlled the B input just manually. Here we can actually now control where the silo cuts off on the bottom. If you wanted to do this on the top, all you would need to do is Shift-D and duplicate this here. We'll plug this again into our A input and set this to greater than. If I replace the selection with this greater than node, I can now control the top fall off as well. You could stack these on top of each other, so we could have two delete geometry nodes, one that has this and one that has this, and we would just need to play with these, and we could refine it even further. But for me, I just wanted to delete some of the ones on the bottom here, so I'm going to set this back to 64.5, and we should be set. The next thing I did was I messed with my buildings a little bit. You can see that not only are they kind of curving around the circle of the silo, but they're also in slightly different positions, so let's quickly go over that. If I enable my geometry nodes building collection and select the buildings down here, we can see what we set up in our last session. One of the things I did was I just repositioned some of these buildings to line up a little bit more accurately here. To get a better view of it, we can enable the silo base collection. And you can see that I've lined these up now to really kind of just be right off the main sidewalk or base layer here. I made this change pretty simply. I added a second transform geometry node, and I just moved some of my buildings until they were in a position I felt right. I think for this building as well, I messed with the rotation. So originally it might have been something like this, where it was closer in like that. And now it's facing this direction instead. So I did the same thing for the other one as well. I just adjusted it a little bit with a transform geometry. This really comes down to personal preference. There's no right way to place your buildings. It actually could be good to have them offset a bit. And if you wanted to spend more time, you could use more assets. You know, I'm only using 2 buildings here. It looks a little repetitive. If you had more, you could offset them in interesting ways. But I just wanted to share that that's what I did in this situation. Now let's quickly talk about how I actually have these buildings curving a little bit. You can see that they're actually bending to fit the shape of the silo. If I open up my building assets collection, you'll be able to see what I did. We have our 2 building assets over here. All I did was add a simple deform modifier, and I set it to the bend mode. I then increased the angle until it was something that I was happy with. For me, that was around 27 degrees. And of course, it's on the Z axis because that is just the way everything worked out. Something you might notice is when you do something like this, you don't have enough loop cuts in your geometry. So for example, maybe straight edges here won't be curving, and you can add some more loop cuts where you feel they might be necessary. I'm going to do 2 here and 2 here, and you can see that that increases the bend compared to the straight one down here. It just helps smooth out that curve a little bit. So that's all I did for these 2 geometries. I just added this bend modifier, and then I went into edit mode and I added some extra loop cuts where I felt they were necessary. So I'm going to close that collection out for now. And I'll leave the geometry nodes building collection enabled because we're going to add in our overhead lights. Before we get started, let's go over to your color management tab in the render properties and set your view transform to AGX and your look to high contrast. Ultimately, at the end of the day, these things don't matter too much. We're going to render these out as raw linear sequences and color it again over in Nuke, but this is great for when you're look deving to just set it to something that you feel is right, and for me, that's always AGX high contrast. But with that out of the way, let's jump over to how we lit this scene. Now, I've already added these, of course, but I want to go over exactly how I added them. So if you see, I've added a bunch of lights to the bottom of this scene, and I've actually just gone ahead and placed them. I created a little collection that I called Building Lights. There's 48, and if you go to the negative Z view, you can see I've just manually placed them where our lights are in our scene. Now, the reason I'm actually using rect lights in the first place, as opposed to actually using just this object as an emissive material, which it is, I do have an emission here with a strength of 1. The reason I use the rect light is because of the amount of noise that it creates. In general, emissive textures create tons of noise in your scene, especially if they are the objects that are being used primarily to light the entire thing. So instead, we supplement that with a rect light, which creates a lot less noise than an emissive texture. Now, I'm sure there's a way to set these to instance all around our scene here with geonodes. However, just for the sake of time, I just created one rect light. I did Alt-D, and I just dragged it, rotated it, and kept on doing the same thing over and over again until I was happy. So there's no fancy way of placing these here. You could do it. I just felt it was more time effective to just place them by hand, and that is all we needed to do. Now, the reason we put this in our GeoNodes collection is because if we look, we can actually see that these are now being instanced by our silo object, so every floor has the lights applied to it already. I also want to quickly go over the powers that I used for these overhead lights here. I didn't really go over it when I recorded this initially. I used a power of 60 that seemed relatively accurate. All I did was I looked through my original scene with my lights turned on, and I tried to just eyeball what I felt was a realistic value. For me, this ended up being anywhere between 50 and 100, and I found 60 to be a nice value. That's 10, not 100 there. If we push it all the way to 100, it feels a little too bright for me, so 60 really did end up being the magic number for me in this instance. Of course, you haven't touched the texture step yet. We'll come back to that in a minute. But for now, I'd set your lights to a value of 50, and we will go from there in the future. Now, something you might notice is that I really haven't been going over how I chose to color my lights. That's because it really is more of an artistic preference, and none of it is really a hard rule. For me, I wanted these overhead lights to be just a little greenish blue in order to give that uncomfortable business-like haze. But one of the best ways to work, in my opinion, of course, is always to start with a saturation of 0, just blank lights, and then you can dial in creative choices like this later. So I'm actually going to set this to a saturation of 0, and we will revisit this later. Now, pulling up our original pillar here, I can show you what I did for the pillar lights. These I chose not to use a light source on, mainly because they are curving around this object, and I really want them wrapping around and being the true source. All I did was created a strength of around 7 or 5 for the source, and I have a mix color here that is being controlled by a noise texture. I brought down the scale just a little bit to be 2, messed with the detail and roughness, and then added a color ramp to just pull things in a little bit further. Now, it doesn't really come through too much, and it might need a little bit more tweaking still, but it's tiny little variations in things like these light sources that are visible that will help really sell the effect that this is a real lamp and not just an emissive texture. Coming back to a project where we didn't have our texture set up yet, this is actually what it will look like with just the lighting and none of our texture set up. So we have a very good baseline to start texturing this environment. Now, let's talk a little bit about being economical with our textures. Your first thought might be to jump over to Megascans and grab a concrete texture and start from there. Maybe you'll grab some rock textures and mix those in. But taking a moment to think, we can realize that we actually have tons of textures here already at our disposal. These buildings from kitbash 3D came with tons of textures applied to them, and there's no reason not to look and see if any of those textures might work for us first before we start adding more into the mix. The easiest way to do this, of course, is to re-enable our silo base object, select the object that we want to texture, and we can just look through these kitbash 3D textures and see if there's any concrete materials that might work. Now in this example, I've actually renamed the kitbash material that I used to custom concrete, but its original name was something like kitbash 3D concrete plaster, and I found that that one worked really well for what I was looking for, and I didn't have to go in and download some new textures to add to my already huge list of textures being used for this project. The second thing I did was I also wanted to add some textures to these railings. Again, I thought, well, these are metal railings. I'm certain that with all the metal in this scene already, there has got to be some metal objects here that can do the trick. And of course, I was right. I used the metal beam texture, and I found that that worked perfectly for me. So I'm just going to plug this back in as well. Now our railings have that nice black metal that really matches the silo aesthetic. But of course, if you just apply these materials like I just did, they're not going to look good the way that they look for me right now. That's because, as you can see over here in my shader editor, I did a lot of little tweaks to bring them up to snuff. So let's go over that. Now, to make this easy to follow along, I've actually reset our texture back to the very default it was when I brought it in and added it to our materials. We can see that it's actually not wrapping around our objects at all because they don't have proper UVs. And by default, the material is actually very warm. We're definitely going to want to cool it down a bit, but let's start by actually getting this properly wrapping around our objects. Now, to start with, instead of using the UV coordinates, I'm going to want to use the object coordinates. This is something you're going to see a lot because whenever you create a procedural texture in Blender, you almost never use the UV coordinates because so much then becomes dependent on the actual object that you're applying it to and not the texture itself. This is a little bit of a way to isolate the two. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to mess with the projection method of our textures. By default, this is always set to a flat projection method, but we're going to switch this over to the box projection method. Now, there really is no easy way to explain how these different projection methods work without a graphic, but the easiest way to say it is that we're drawing a big box around our object, and all the rays are shooting from the side of the box onto our faces of our geometry, and that is how the projection is being done. Again, I know that is a crazy explanation. It definitely needs its own video, and it might be something I tackle in the future. But for now, we can see that we're getting a lot closer already. However, there's a lot of tiling going on, so we're going to want to mess with the object scale just a bit. For me, I found a value about 0.5 to 0.6 worked out pretty well. We can really make out the material now on the sides of the wall here, and I think 0.5 works just great. Now, one additional level of change we're going to want to do to our textural coordinates is allow them to change as the floors move up in level. That's because by default, we're really only applying this texture to the top, or I guess the bottom floor, and it's just being copied every time we add a new floor. In order to add some randomness, what I'm going to do is take an object info node and take the location and plug this into the location input of our mapping node. A really easy way to visualize this would be to take a noise texture, and we'll just crunch this up pretty heavily here, and we'll make this a value of like 1. And if I unplug the location, we can see that the noise texture is identical on this bridge as it is to the bridge down here. But when we plug in this location, there's a bit of variation to all these different layers because it's actually dependent on the location of the object. So you'll never have duplicates going from one level to the next. Just a tiny bit of variation that goes a long way, and that is why we add that. But now let's fix the color of this a bit. Like I said before, this is a very warm texture, so I'm going to add in a hue, saturation, and value node. And personally, I'm just going to kill the saturation. I'm going to set it to 0. Maybe I'm wrong for thinking this, but concrete should be gray. It really doesn't need any color. So just killing the saturation there works perfectly for me. And we're already getting pretty close, but of course there are tons of different layers of detail we can add to this. So let's dive into those. One of the first things I want to add is I just want some splotches of areas to be a bit darker than others. It'll add some variation to this texture to make it seem less monotonous. And I'm going to do that by adding in a noise texture. And I'm going to have the vector be the same vector we used earlier. I'm going to increase the detail and roughness quite a bit, maybe something like that, and I'm going to then add in a color ramp so I can control it even further. We'll then use a mix color node to mix these two together, and I'm going to set this to a multiply operation. Obviously, this is going to make our scene a lot darker, a lot quicker, but that of course is because we're going from a value of 0 to a value of 1. Instead, we can make this something a lot less significant. Maybe a value of 0.5 would be nice. I'm going to look through my color ramp so we can really dial in this noise. So if I look through here, we can start seeing how this might look. And I think this scale is just a bit too high frequency, so I'm going to set it down to something like a value of 1, and I think that will create the breakup that I'm looking for. Let's look through it again. There we go. That is a lot nicer. We have a bunch more variation on our concrete now, and I'd say it's actually a little too much. So let's set this to like a value of 0.7. We really don't need it to be overwhelming, just enough to create some changes in the color throughout space. And I think, yeah, a value of 0.7 there works just right. So the next thing I want to do is I actually want to add some ambient occlusion to this whole scene. Ambient occlusion essentially means that as one object is in proximity to another, it gets darker. In real life, you have a lot of natural ambient occlusion, and even here we do. We can see that due to the lighting over here and from the ground, we have this darker area behind the light source as things are being occluded. Of course, ambient occlusion also works to darken areas like this, where you would normally expect some dirt to build up in these little crevices or ledges that we see. So let's add in an ambient occlusion node. There we go, ambient occlusion. It doesn't need 16 samples. We can drop that down to 8 for now. And again, we'll duplicate this multiply node. And we're going to want to multiply it by our color output. And then I'm going to add in a color ramp here to actually view the ambient occlusion for now, because I want to really, truly dial this in. Now, something we want to avoid is things like this, where we're going to essentially be duplicating the shadows that we talked about earlier. We really want to just create areas of dust buildup. So as I crunch this up, I've checked this only local box so that doesn't happen. Now, no matter how much I crunch this, however, it's never going to really look like dirt. It's just going to be this linear gradient coming from our source. And one of the ways we can add variation is we can add in a noise texture and plug this into the distance of our ambient occlusion node. So I've got it to a place that I'm pretty happy with now. I've set my scale just at default, and I've just dialed in this color ramp somewhere I'm happy with. I think really we don't need a lot of dirt building up, remember, we just want a little bit. And then we can control the intensity with the multiply factor here. So let's look through. We can see, of course, this is really dark, and multiply it by a lower value. So maybe something like 0.5 would be good. Maybe 0.6, and we really get that kind of buildup on the edge here. Now, I think I actually want to bring this down a bit so we just get a little bit more than we have right now. I think that right there is exactly what I'm looking for. Now, personally, I'm pretty happy with how this ended up looking. We have this nice little, darker edge around our lamps here. We have the same thing over on the floor, by the edge of these, railings on the walkway, just on the edges. It also adds some darkness, in the corner of these stairs as we go up them as well, which is really nice. And it's just this tiny little quality of life thing that I feel adds a little bit to the whole thing. Now, the last thing I want to do for this concrete layer is actually do a little bit of meddling with our roughness layer. To start with, let's crunch up the roughness of this texture here a little bit. If we look at this with a color ramp, we can see that it really is fully, there's no wetness to it at all. I'm just going to crunch that up a little bit. I usually like doing that just for the hell of it. It adds a little bit more sheen in some areas, which I think occasionally can look a little nice. Let's pull that back down a little bit though. Next and finally, I want to add some puddles, because everyone knows that a 3D render isn't complete without some puddles on the floor. So let's do that real quick. To start with, I'm going to duplicate this mapping section here. I'm going to set this back to 1, and let's actually create our puddle map. Like always, we're going to use a noise texture with a vector plugged in like that. And this time we need to do a couple things a little differently, because this texture is being applied to the sides of our objects as well as the floor. And we only want the puddles on the floor. We don't need, wet spots on the sides of our object here. So in order to do that, we need to isolate stuff that is pointing upwards. We can do that using the normals of the geometry, adding in a separate XYZ node and taking the normals from the texture coordinate. If we look through the Z version, we can see that we're isolating it now just to stuff that is pointing up. Now we don't really want this stuff on the sidewalls here, so we'll use a color ramp set to constant to control exactly where we get that drop off here. So it's going to be very high up. We just need to push it far enough where it doesn't break. So I think something just like this works perfectly. Our puddle map, which is going to be this noise texture, which we need to dial in now. By the way, I know I haven't said this. I probably should have a long time ago. In order to view textures like this, you do Control-Shift and then you click on the node, and that lets you view the node. I can't believe I forgot to mention that, but that is how you do it. Let's set this to something really big, a value of 1 perhaps, or maybe even 0.5. And we want just these big areas of puddles here. So we'll add in a color ramp, and we will dial these puddles in. So puddles will be the black area on the color ramp here. And I definitely know I don't want just wet spots on the floor everywhere. So we should really just focus on having bigger puddles, or big areas of puddle. So something like that, I think, will be perfect. Now that we have our puddle map here and our isolation map here, all I'm going to do is add in a math node, and I'm actually going to do A subtracted by B. So this is just going to leave us with our puddles, and all we need to do is do the exact same thing to our actual roughness path here. So instead of doing a mix, we'll do mix color this time. We'll set this to subtract with a value of 1. And I want to take our original roughness map and have it subtract our secondary roughness map. And if we look through this output, we can see that we're left with just the puddles, setting it to black. And if we feel like this looks a little weird, having the bottom layer black like that, we can set this to a multiply operation and maybe set it to something like 2. And then we can really just dial in our puddle maps here. So I'm going to pull this actually all the way to the end, and we'll set this to something like this, and that is something I'm pretty happy with. If we look through our principled BSDF now, we have these nice puddles on the ground. I think there's a little too many, so let's refine this a little bit further. We'll pull this a little bit more in, so there's a little bit less. Something like this, perhaps. And I think that is all we need. We can make this a little bit more, perhaps, something like that. And there we go. We have some nice puddles on the floor. If we look over here, we see we have some puddles over here as well. And that is all we needed. That's actually it for this base concrete layer here. There's a couple different additions we can add, but really this is the gist of it. Now it just comes down to messing with your different color ramps and really dialing in the look you want. To quickly go over how I did these railings, all I did was I took the exact same principles we used for the base concrete layer, where I took the metal texture that I think was on these pipes here, and I applied it to the railings. The only change I made, of course, so I set the mapping of the texture instead of the UV. I think I used the generated coordinates, and that's how we got our railings looking the way we did. Now that we have our final look, before we really wrap things up, I quickly want to show you how I have these lights on the bottom layer turned off while our top main layer here is turned on. As you can see in our GeoNodes building thing here, we have our GeoNode lights. If I select one and look over at the object material view, normally this would be something that's blank, but I checked use nodes, and you can actually set up textures like you would on any material. Here, just like how we isolated the positions for our instances in GeoNodes, I did the same thing where I took the position and separated it by XYZ, and then I used a greater than node to create a threshold of when the light should turn on. Essentially, think of every 10 or so increments here as a floor, which is 10 meters. So if I set this to 80, we would turn on the floor that's below us here, like this, and it actually looks like it turns on the floor below that one as well, so maybe it's 85. we can see, yeah, it's 85. So it's every 5 or so meters. So it's a really unique way to control how these lights work, where I can set this to a value of 80, and then we have these lower levels turned on, but I didn't want them on because I felt like it created a more visually interesting render here to have these bottom floors turned off. So I just wanted to quickly show off how I turned off these lights on the bottom levels. I set this to a value of 90, and that worked for me. But of course, you know, however you set up your camera for your final render, you might or might not want to do this. It's just a little extra bit of pizzazz you can do to really control the lighting in your scene. Hey guys, Alex from the future here. So I want to quickly go up how I set up the volumetrics for this scene because I realized that I forgot to do so in the original video recording. So I have a plugin that I've made that you can download in the description called Simple Fog, and it is $5, and it is the primary way for you to currently support the Level Up Plus VFX channel. This is my alternative to having a Patreon. I really dislike the idea of having this open-ended platform of selling stuff, and I absolutely hate the idea of selling courses, so I figured that actually being able to give you guys something would be a good compromise, and the first thing on this list has been Simple Fog, which is a plugin that I made for Blender. Simple Fog creates a volumetric cube with a lot of the default stuff that you would use in any environment scene for volumetrics. In this example, I used the haze preset and just brought the density down to 0.01, and then I put it in my scene, and that is all there was to it. If you look here, you can see it just creates this bounding box, and you are set. However, of course, if you don't have the money or you don't want to pay for something that should be this simple, which is totally understandable, I want to show you how you can do this yourself. So I just did a simplified version where I created a cube object and I created a principled volume here with a density of 0.01 and an anisotropy of 0.5, and that'll get you like 99% of the way there with what Simple Fog did. Simple Fog is just essentially automating this process because I use this kind of setup in almost every single scene that I make. So having a one-shot button here that you can just click and it does it has always been super useful, and it's probably saved me hours of time of just doing the exact same thing over and over again. Simple Fog, of course, also has a bunch of nice control sliders that you can mess with here that you would have to set up manually if you did so. It's also over here if you look. And if you look into the actual node setup, you can see it's a little bit more complicated than just a principled volume, but 95% of the time, this is all you need. So I just wanted to show you that you could do that there as well. And of course, give a little shout out to my plugin. It currently has some presets like Cloudscape and the default, which actually comes with a cool ground layer of fog. So this is great for low angle shots where you actually want some physical fog like wisps in your scene. You can also control wind, which is really cool. But anyway, that's it for the volumetrics part of this tutorial. Really something I just wanted to quickly go over because I forgot to in the original recording. To finish up this episode, the last thing I did was I added my Simple Fog volume here, which adds a global fog to our scene. And I popped over into the compositor as well and just did a light, dirty little color grade to the whole thing to make it a little bit more blue. All I did here, of course, was I took my lift and I just pushed it in the blue direction. And I think because my lights are now white, it's a little bit more blue than it should be. I can go over to my GeoNodes building lights, and this is why we waited till now to mess with these. As we go into the color, I could push this to be just a little bit more green again. And wow, that is looking pretty cool if you ask me. Now, as we get closer and closer to finishing up this Silo Environment series, I really want to say thank you to all of you who have been sticking around the channel and, learning with the stuff I provide. I'm very grateful to you guys. The whole reason I'm making this entire series is to really be a kickstart guide for people who want to get into creating environment art but don't know where to start. Nothing we've really done in this entire project is revolutionary information. It's all information you've probably heard in one place or another before. One of the big things when it comes to learning 3D as a profession is just how to string pieces of information together in order to get to a final product. When it comes to environment art especially, It isn't about reinventing the wheel so much as it is trusting the process and trusting that if you do a certain set of steps, you'll get a consistent result. That is what this whole series is about. But with that, we've finally come to the end of our second part of our silo environment series. We've gone over a lot and we're really close to the finish line. One of my favorite sayings is that 90% of the project takes 50% of the time, and we are definitely at that 90% mark. The next section will be all about creating props and adding decals to our existing environment. And then finally, in our last video, we'll go over the compositing in Nuke. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you in the next part, which definitely will come out sooner than this one did. I've been Alex from Level Up Plus VFX. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.